Well, thanks everyone for coming on Zoom tonight to learn more about voter registration. A lot of this training is the same as other trainings that we've done in past years. We do try and change it up a little bit based on what election is coming up. So I'll include some information about how primaries are different than general elections and some of the candidates and issues that people will be voting on here in Franklin County in March. I am Elizabeth Grieser. I'm the operations manager, the staff at the League of Women Voters here in Metropolitan Columbus. We're a grassroots organization. We have about 450 volunteer members that help us do most of the boots on the ground voter registration work. So I hope after you've taken this training, if you're interested, you can sign up for some of our voter registration opportunities coming up this spring, summer, and fall. We'll have a lot of them. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the League, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. That means we never support or oppose political candidates or political parties. Okay, so we're going to cover a bunch of different things, mostly related with registration, but a little bit of detail about what is coming up on the primary election on March 19th. First, I wanted to cover the new Ohio voting laws. They are still new. They've been in place for less than a year. They were approved by the Ohio General Assembly in January of 2023, and they went into effect in April of last year. So we've had two elections now with these new voting laws, the August special election and then the November election. The biggest change to Ohio voting laws between 2023, early 2023, 2022, and today are that voters must present a photo ID when voting in person. And the number of acceptable IDs is much smaller than it was before. And I have a little graphic on the next slide that will talk about that. The other changes to the voting laws have to do more with deadlines. So there's absolutely no need for you to memorize all of these, but just kind of know that a lot of the deadlines have been shortened. So for example, you need to request a mail-in ballot at least 7 days before election day, whereas before you could request it, I think about 2 or 3 days before the election day. It's also shortened when mail-in ballots can arrive at the Board of Elections after election day. So mail-in ballots now have to arrive at least or within 4 days of election day. So that's usually the Saturday after the election. It limited the number of drop boxes per county, and it also eliminated the in-person voting the day before election day and reallocated those hours into other days earlier in the election cycle. Okay, so this is the graphic that talks about the differences in IDs. Voters are still new to this law, so a lot of them aren't used to it. We also know that a lot of voters vote in presidential years that don't vote any other time. So this year we will be, dealing with voters, talking with voters who may be voting for the first time since these voting laws have been put in place. The big difference is that you have to have a photo ID to vote in person. That includes on election day and when you go and vote at the Board of Elections during early vote. That does not include mail-in absentee ballots. So what you need to have is an Ohio photo ID, which is either a driver's license or a state ID. There are certain military IDs which will work. You can also use a passport now, which is something you could not use before. It's interesting, and I've had this question a number of times. The U.S. passport does not have your address on it. And that's apparently not a problem. You don't have to bring a secondary form of ID. You can just bring your U.S. passport. There are a number of ID forms that are no longer acceptable that many voters have relied on in the past, and that includes like utility bills, bank statements, paychecks, anything that has a current address on them. So those are no longer an acceptable form of voter ID. Okay, so this little chart just kind of shows you the different ways you can vote in Ohio and where and when you need the photo ID. So you need the photo ID when you're voting on election day, when you're voting early in person, but you don't need it for absentee voting. And we'll kind of go over more details about these different ways of voting a little bit later on. So who can vote in Ohio? Oh, Bridget, go ahead.
A question back on the slide about the driver's license.
Yeah.
Does it have to be current?
Good question.
Because it's like a double negative. So licenses expired may not be used.
Yes. So if your license is not current, you cannot use it. It's not valid. It has to be a current driver's. It cannot be expired. It does not have to have your current address on it, though. So if you moved within the last year, but your driver's license is still current with an old address, that's fine. You can still use it for voter ID.
Okay, well, I think that's phrased wrong, that asterisk.
Expired licenses
may not be used, and your thing says no.
Oh, I think that this is probably not lined up. It's supposed to mean like it was
acceptable and now isn't.
Now isn't. I think I'll just black out this yes, no on the last one because that is confusing.
That was confusing. All right, thank you.
So no expired licenses. And you'd be surprised a lot of voters do show up with expired driver's license on election day. That's one of the main feedbacks we get from poll workers about who ends up voting provisionally is people with expired driver's license. So who can vote in Ohio? You have to be a U.S. citizen. You must be 18 by election day. This fact is definitely more, well, it's always a fact, but for 2024 in Ohio, people who will be 18 by the November general election will be able to vote in the primary election for candidates. So not for issues, but for candidates. So we have a large number of 17-year-olds that are eligible to register to vote and are eligible to vote in the primary election for any of the candidates that are that are running in a primary race.
And just to clarify, when it says by election day, if their birthday is election day, they're eligible, right?
Correct. Yes.
I know one of those.
Oh, really? That's funny. So yes, he or she can vote on election day. They will not be able to vote on any issues, and they won't be able to vote on any of the central party candidates, which I have another slide on that later. But they're probably not too interested in voting on that anyways. They can vote for the presidential primaries, any of the congressional or the state or county primary races. And then another important point I wanted to make sure everyone was clear on is that in Ohio, as long as a person is not currently serving time for a felony conviction, they can vote. And the reason there tends to be some confusion about this is because each state has different rules. So in some states, if you have a felony conviction, you cannot vote ever again. In Ohio, as long as you're not currently in jail or prison for the felony, you can vote. You do have to re-register to vote after you have served your time. So when you are convicted, your voter registration is null and void. And then when you are released, you can re-register. And at that point, you can start voting again. So you can't rely on a previous voter registration from before you serve time, but after you can re-register and start voting again. So there's a couple special classes of voters I wanted to spend a little bit of time on before we get into the forms and the nuts and bolts about registering voters. One is transient or homeless individuals. There is a myth out there that you have to have a permanent address in order to register to vote. You do not. Technically, you can register to vote at like the park bench on the corner of Main and Broad Street. It's just a little hard to get mail there. But technically that would be a perfectly valid voter registration address. So for individuals who are homeless, they can register to vote. Usually homeless shelters or local community organizations where they receive services will accept mail on their behalf. So for example, the league usually does voter registration at the local YMCA shelters. The YMCA staff will give us information, volunteers information about what address they prefer that these individuals use. And we work with them to make sure that the registrations are getting sent in and that they know that if this individual gets mail from the Board of Elections, that whole process is working. The changes in the Ohio voting law have made voting a little more difficult for homeless individuals. One reason is because the in-person voting may be prohibitive due to the change in ID requirements. So oftentimes individuals that are homeless will not have driver's license or the state ID that they would need to have to vote in person. And then absentee voting, while it doesn't require an ID, it does require a number of steps. It includes filling out forms, sending in letters, having a stamp, getting letters in return, following up several times. So neither way is a perfect option for voting, but we do try and work with the homeless shelters, with the social workers that are working in that community to make the voting process as easy as possible. And if anyone has comments or thoughts about working with any of these populations, feel free to chime in. The other population I wanted to mention is college students. Again, we've had some difficulties with this population because of the changes in the voter ID laws. So out-of-state students who apply for an Ohio ID or driver's license should be informed that this will invalidate their home state license or ID. So if an out-of-state college student, like let's say they're from Michigan and they have a Michigan driver's license, if they want to vote in Ohio, and so they apply for an Ohio ID or driver's license, it's probably not a smart choice for them because it's going to invalidate their home state driver's license. Now they can use a passport if they have one of those. If they don't, it is a little expensive to just get a passport, but if they have a passport, they can use that to vote in Ohio in person. We have been advising students who want to vote, out-of-state students who want to vote in Ohio, that they should vote early with an absentee ballot. Of course, that's not a perfect solution either. We've had some issues in 2024, I know at Ohio State, in which a number of college students did not receive their absentee ballots in time to vote in the election. So they ended up voting provisionally on election day. It's a little bit of a mess. So that it's a little sticky for out-of-state students who want to vote in Ohio. But college students, in some ways, have a little more choice than the rest of us because they can choose to either register and vote at their campus address or at their family's home address. So if you have an individual whose family lives in Cuyahoga County and they're living in Columbus at OSU and going to school here, they can choose if they want to vote here in Columbus or in Cleveland, and they can change their voting location for every election if they want to. All they have to do is fill out a new voter registration form and change their address. Any questions about college students? Okay, so now we're on to the forms. There is one form in Ohio that covers registering a first-time voter, it covers address changes, and it covers name changes. So it's a one-page form. I've split it up onto 3 different slides so you can see the details of it, but these next 3 slides are all, you know, a one-page form. So the first questions, are you a US citizen, and will you be 18 years on or before the next general election? We want to make sure those are both checked yes. That's an easy thing for people to miss. The form is pretty simple. You're filling out your last name, your address, the county where you live. You have to supply your birth date and your driver's license number or the last 4 digits of your social security number. This is not a form where you have to provide any kind of photo ID. That's only for the voting, not for the voter registration. The middle part of the form you would fill out if you are updating your address, or if you're changing your name. And then the bottom portion of the form is where you would sign and then put today's date. So pretty simple, but voters make mistakes all of the time. So here are a few of the common errors. Not checking that citizenship, age eligibility section, putting their birth date on the signature line when it asks for today's date. Oftentimes, or sometimes people will put a P.O. box. You can't put a P.O. box as your mailing address. It has to be an actual physical location. Otherwise, the Board of Election doesn't know what precinct to assign you to. And then one of the most common, I don't know if I would consider it a mistake, but something that can cause problems when you're registering is that people don't write legibly. So the poor staff of the Board of Elections have to decipher your handwriting. And if they're not sure if this is a 6 or a 9, they might input your address incorrectly, and then, things won't turn out the way you want. Bridget?
One other point we always make is when they sign in that little box, their whole signature needs to be contained within that box. And some people
Yes.
write big and it goes out of the lines, and that fouls up their the way they compare signatures when you go to vote.
Yes, thank you. That's a great point. And also the signature, you should encourage folks to sign in the manner that they will remember how they signed. And I know that that sounds weird, but so I'm going to use my mom as an example. Her first name is Wanda, and she really dislikes that name. So she goes by Jeannie. And she wrote Jeannie Greaser in her voter registration. And so that's the signature they have on file for her. But then when she came to vote and her driver's license said Wanda, and she signed Wanda in the book, it didn't match. And so there, they had to kind of work all of that out. So just whatever someone's signing, they should sign the name that they usually use for government documents. And then another fact is that you as a volunteer can feel free to fill out the form for the individual, but they must sign it. So if it's someone who needs help completing it, you can feel free to write in all of the information except for the signature. Okay, returning someone's registration forms. If you're returning someone else's forms, they must be returned within 10 days of when the voter registration form was signed, or by the voter registration deadline, which in this case is February 20th. So you can return it, technically you can return it to the Secretary of State's office downtown, but I would highly recommend returning it to the Board of Elections office on Morse Road.
If you take a voter registration for someone from a different county, what do you do with that? Is that
Yeah, that's a great question. So we often do voter registrations for people in different counties, especially if you're at a festival in the summer, there's people coming in from all over the place. You can use that same form that we talked about for any county in Ohio. So let's say you have someone from Lake County that fills it out, and you're not going to go drive up to Lake County to the Board of Elections to turn it in. You can just mail it in there. That's normally what I do. Yeah.
But you can't just turn it into the Franklin County Board. They won't forward it on.
So you can. It kind of depends who is at the front desk at
Okay.
the Board of Elections. Sometimes they'll take them. But what they do is they just stick them in the mail and send them up to the Lake County
Sure.
Board of Elections or whatever. But I've also gone in to do that before, and then the staff member working the front desk will say, "Oh no, we're only taking the ones for this county." So it kind of depends on the day. But if you are doing a league voter registration event, usually what will happen is that after the event, you'll drop all of the forms off to
Right.
me, and I'll take them in person. Or if they're, out of county, I'll mail them in person. So you won't have to worry about that. But, if you're doing registration with a different organization or just on your own, you will want to return it to the Board of Elections, and you can mail them. You don't have to turn them in person. So after you have talked to the voter, got them to fill out the form, you want to let them know what happens next. And that is that within 20 business days, they should be receiving some mail from the Board of Elections that registers them about that lets them know where their precinct is, where their polling location is going to be located, and identification requirements for voting. So we talked about how you can do this process using the hard copy form, and we do usually use the hard copy form when we're going out as volunteers and talking to people at events or festivals, but you can register to vote online. And there's a lot of times that we encourage people to do that, especially when we're doing social media posts, online information, letting people know that you can go to the Secretary of State's website and register online, and they're going to ask you all the same questions that the hard copy form did. And it's a pretty easy process. The only people that do need to fill out a hard copy form and not an online form are individuals that don't have a presence in Ohio. So if you just moved to Ohio from out of state, never lived here before, never filed taxes in Ohio, never had an Ohio driver's license, there's no record of you in the state system. So if that's the case, you will want to file a hard copy form, because when you file the online form, they use your previous electronic presence with the state in order to verify that. Bridget.
Now that can be an issue. I mean, that's something true for younger voters. If
Yes.
they've not gotten a driver's license, chances are they don't have a state ID. They may never have worked or paid taxes in Ohio, or so, you have to ask those questions before you let them try to register online.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I would probably recommend anyone that's registering for the first time to just fill out the hard copy form, so they can be sure that it'll be counted and there's no problems. The online registration portal is really great if you want to change your address, update your address or your name. You can do that really quickly. Bridget?
Yeah, the one issue with that is kids don't really do anything by mail anymore.
Yeah.
So when you
Yes.
tell them,
Yeah.
if they want to take it with them and mail it in, it's really, you have to explain to them, you have to put a stamp on it and what a stamp is. I mean, we've literally had to tell kids, a stamp you buy at the post office, because they don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
They're more inclined to just do everything online. So make sure they understand, if we're doing youth events where there's a lot of young people, that, how they best do it. Yeah.
Right. No, I agree. I think that there are a number of places that the Ohio election system is out of date, and we're relying too much on paper forms that require mailing, and that is foreign to a number of people in our communities, especially younger voters. And when you're asking college students to, check their mailbox for important materials, that's also kind of foreign to them as well. So, yeah, when you're talking to a younger voter and you are just giving them information about how to register, and you're not actually, giving them out the form and then turning them in for them. Another tip is that in Ohio, libraries are required to accept and turn in voter registration forms for people. I think most people don't know that, but if you go to any library, they should have the forms there. You can give them your completed voter registration form, and they are required by law to turn that in for you. So that's a way to get around the stamp requirement. But I think it's only voter registration forms, though. It's not like the absentee ballot requests or any of the supplemental forms. Okay. Next I want to talk a little bit about voter purges, because that is a reason why we ask all of our volunteers to talk to voters about verifying their registration. Often when we're out in the community, you ask someone if they're registered to vote, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah." But it could be that they have been purged off the rolls if they have not voted in a while. So the last purge happened October 2023. Almost about 26,000 Ohioans were purged from the voter rolls. This happened maybe like 2 or 3 weeks before the general election, which was not great timing. But purges happen maybe once, sometimes twice a year. And there's a lot of reasons why you can be taken off of the voter rolls. A lot of them are very valid reasons, like voters have passed away or they moved out of state. They're no longer eligible to vote in Ohio. But this is not a perfect process. We do know of a number of voters who have been taken off the rolls and they weren't supposed to be. So the best practice is to verify that everyone's registration is current when you're out at a voter registration event. And you can do that through the Secretary of State's website by putting in your first, or the voter's first name, last name, and their county. And if their profile comes up with their current address, then they're all set. They're registered to vote in Ohio with their current address. If their name comes up with an address that they're no longer living at, they will need to update their voter registration list. And if nothing comes up, then your best bet is just to have them fill out another voter registration form and turn it in. There's nothing wrong, nothing bad will happen if you fill out a duplicate voter registration form. The Board of Elections will just take the most recent form that they've been given and input that into the system. Bridget?
People often forget if they've changed their name
Yes.
for marriage or divorce, that they never really think to update their voter registration. And that's something you do.
Yeah, and
they're like, oh yeah, I forgot.
Yeah, and I think it happens pretty often that people will be very certain that they're registered, and then when they look up their name, they're not there. So, for whatever reason. So if you can get someone to stop and just take a minute to look up their registration, that can be really useful. And we have, when we go out into the community and we have a table, we usually have QR codes. People can look that up on their own phone very easily. And we also have just materials people can take with them and look it up later. Okay, so voting options for 2024, Election Day, May 19th, 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. at your local polling location. The early voting is going to start February 21st at the Board of Elections office, and all 88 counties in Ohio will have the same early vote hours. That's usually Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. There's some additional hours the last 2 weekends, and the last week before the election, there's some later hours, so it can be like 8 to 7 some days. There's no hours the day before Election Day. And then absentee or mail-in voting also starts February 21st. So that's the day that the Board of Elections will mail out the ballots, and you have to apply for your mail-in ballot by March 12th. That's the last day you can submit your absentee request. So a little bit more about absentee ballot applications. In the past, the Ohio Secretary of State has mailed out these ballot request forms to all registered voters for the general elections, but we know that they will not be mailing those out for the primary election. And I'm not sure if they're going to mail them out for the upcoming general election or not. I will definitely try to have that information when we do our general election voter registration training. But for the upcoming primary election, people will have to find these applications on their own. You can print them out online. You can find them at your local library, at the Board of Elections. They cannot be submitted online, so they have to be printed out, hard copy, signed, and mailed to the Board of Elections, or you can turn them in person. And you can start doing that now. They're taking absentee ballot applications now at the Board of Elections. This is a picture of what that application looks like. And again, this form works for all 88 counties in Ohio. So you can apply for your absentee ballot with your date of birth and the last 4 digits of your social or your Ohio driver's license number. You will want to check that you're voting in the primary election, which is number 7, kind of halfway down on this chart. You don't necessarily have to know the date because the Board of Elections will know when the primary election is, but this is the really important part for this coming election. You will need to select if you want a Democrat, a Republican, or an issues-only ballot, because those are 3 separate ballots, and you can only vote on one of them. So the voter needs to select which ballot they want and then sign and put in today's or the day's date that they filled this out. And you can have your absentee ballot sent to whatever address you want. It doesn't have to be the address where you're registered. If you know you're going to be in Florida for 3 months this winter, you can have them send your ballot to Florida and you can fill it out there and then mail it back to Ohio. Okay, so tracking your absentee ballot, the Secretary of State has set up a system where you can track your mail-in ballot similar to tracking an Amazon package. You do have to sign up for this service, which you can do that on the Franklin County Board of Elections website, but it works really well. I've used it before. The program will send you a text or an email for 3 different steps in the process. The first one is when the absentee ballot application is received by the Board of Elections. You'll get a second text when the absentee ballot is put in the mail to you. And then after you fill out the ballot, send it back, you'll get a third text when the absentee ballot is received back at the Board of Elections, so you know they've actually gotten and processed your ballot. Okay, so primary ballot options. You cannot vote for, well, I guess I should say it this way. You have to pick which party you want to vote for. So you can either vote for Republican candidates or you can vote for Democrat candidates. You can't vote for Republican candidates for the primary election for president and the Democrat candidates for US Senate. It doesn't work like that. You have to just make the decision which party ballot you want. If you don't want to select any ballot or any party, that's completely fine. You can select a ballot that just has issues only. In Ohio, the technical way that people know if you're either Republican or Democrat leaning is they can look at your voting history, which is public record, and see, oh, Elizabeth requested a Republican primary ballot in 2024. And I can see she's requested a Republican primary ballot, every primary for the last 15 years. So maybe we should start sending her Republican mailing and get her on those lists. So when voters ask, how can I change my party? Or how do I officially sign up to be a Democrat? That's the answer. There's no kind of official check mark, hey, I'm Democrat, hey, I'm Republican. It's really people and organizations are looking at your voting history and seeing which party's ballot you voted during the primary elections. And in Ohio, you can switch it up. You don't have to be always vote Democrat or always vote Republican. You can decide that when you get to the polls on election day. Bridget.
Yeah, and I have been asked in the general election, I have had people say, well, I voted, Democratic, does that mean I have to vote Democratic in the, in the general election? People don't understand, and you need to explain to them, just if you pull one ballot for the primary, has nothing to do with who you vote for in the general.
Yes,
Yeah.
there is, I agree. There's a lot of confusion. And some of that has to do with the fact that different states operate differently. And other states, you can't just decide on election day, hey, I'm going to vote on the Democrat ballot. You have to have decided that ahead of time. And there actually was legislation in the Ohio legislature this past year that would have required voters to select their party ballot at least 30 days before the election. Now that didn't pass. But there's a lot of like push and pull with the political parties about, who should be voting in different primaries. But in Ohio, we have an open primary and you can select whichever party ballot you would like. The biggest frustration that I've come across with voters is that, well, they want to vote for the Republican candidates in the presidential election, but there's another local race and they want to make sure they're voting for the Democrat primary race, because that's the one that's really contested. But you can't do that. You got to decide which race is the most important to you, and just vote that ballot. Okay, so what's on the ballot in Franklin County? We have presidential primary candidates. We have the U.S. Senate. We have U.S. House of Representatives for certain House races. If you live in District 15, which is Mike Carey's district, there is a Democrat primary in that race. There's not a contested primary for the 3rd district, which is currently Joyce Beatty's district. We are going to have numerous Ohio House seats that have contested primaries. There is a contested Franklin County race, which is the county prosecutor on the Democrat side. We're going to have some contested primaries for the Ohio Supreme Court, which should be very interesting. We'll also have state and county central committee members, which my next slide is what that means. And then there are a few like local township tax issues, but there's no state or countywide issues on the ballot. So in the primaries, voters will vote on party committee members, and that means a party committee member is a member of the Republican or Democrat party that are the governing bodies for the Ohio Democrat and Ohio Republican parties. So they manage party operations and direct the general policies of the parties. So they are technically elected officials, but they're not serving the general public. They are, steering the local and state political parties. Okay. Any questions about what's going to be on the ballot in the primary? Okay. So if you do volunteer with the league to do some voter registration events, we have a number of resources and hard copy materials that you'll be given. We have Power the Vote cards, which basically is a postcard size material that has infos on a lot of what I just covered here: general ways to vote, ID information, important voting links. We do have a candidate and issue guide on vote411.org. Right now, there's nothing on it because I haven't yet surveyed the primary candidates, but closer to the election, there will be candidate profiles and issue information. We also have specific materials for various voting communities, voting with a felony conviction, if you're voting and you have disabilities, election protection and what that means. And we do have a number of QR codes, but I talked a little bit about earlier, to help people look up their voter registration and to find their legislative districts. So we also help, apart from voter registration, we also do a lot of election protection closer to the election while early voting is going on at the Board of Elections, to make sure voters get their questions answered. And then if voters are having trouble voting for any reason, or if they have questions, there is a national toll-free hotline, 1-866-OUR-VOTE, that they can call. And this one helps them answer their questions about voting, but also we encourage people to call, because that really helps us on the local level understand what problems voters are facing in the moment, and helps us, craft a response or figure out how to fix some of these problems in the future. And then I also wanted to mention Vote Writers. It's a national organization, and they do have, I think, one staff member here in Ohio. They are an organization whose specific mission is to help individuals get photo IDs that are valid voter IDs. So they, if you're working with a voter or a group that that serves a lot of individuals that needs help with IDs, they're a great group to get in touch with, and they can help pay fees to get the IDs and just talk them through the process. Okay, tips for voter outreach. Just really quickly, most of you already know this, but be friendly and outgoing. Start with a question. And the most important thing is to be nonpartisan. I know that can be really tough, and we're heading into a presidential election year in which emotions are heated and people have very strong feelings about candidates. But with the League of Women Voters, our goal is to make sure that everyone who is eligible is registered to vote. They know how, where, when, why to vote. We're not here to ask them who they're voting for or convince them to vote for a particular candidate. We want to make sure everyone is participating in the democratic process. And then finally, you don't have to know all the answers. I think that's also really an important point. A lot of times volunteers are hesitant because they feel like they're not an expert. You don't have to be an expert. Just having a conversation with a voter can be really important.